Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to tonight's program celebrating the opening of our newest special exhibition, The Book Smugglers, Partisans, Poets, and the Race to Save Jewish Treasures from the Nazis. It's on view at the museum starting tomorrow through January 2nd, 2022. And you're going to want to come see it very soon. It's really an incredible exhibit. I'd like to start this evening by extending a special thank you to everyone supporting this exhibit. Our exhibition sponsors, the Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission, and Joanne and Charles Teichman and Elong 23. Our exhibition community partners are the Aaron Family JCC, Crow Museum of Asian Art at the University of Texas at Dallas, Dallas Video Fest, Human Rights Campaign Dallas, Fort Worth, Legacy Senior Communities, Mosaic Family Services, Southwest Jewish Congress, Temple Shalom, and the World Affairs Council of Dallas, Fort Worth. Thank you all so much for your partnership. We really appreciate your support. I would also like to extend a special welcome to our board members and museum members watching tonight. Your support helps us continue to offer programs like these. Thank you so much. The Book Smugglers exhibition, which is curated by Holocaust Museum Houston and based on the book by David E Fishman, begins with a central question. Would you risk your life to save a book? The exhibition tells the nearly unbelievable true story of ghetto residents during the Holocaust who rescued thousands of rare books and manuscripts by hiding them on their persons, burying them in bunkers, and smuggling them across borders. Set in Vilna, Lithuania, known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania for its rich Jewish culture, a small group of partisans and poets risked everything to save Jewish cultural treasures. I hope all of you will visit the museum soon to see this incredible exhibition. And I have to brag on our incredible internal exhibition team for doing such a wonderful job putting this together for you. They've transformed our space. Tonight, we are thrilled to have David E Fishman, author of The Book Smugglers, with us. Dr. Fishman is a professor of Jewish history at the Jewish Theological Seminary and director of Project Judaica, JTS's program in the former Soviet Union, FSU. He is the author of numerous books and articles on the history and culture of East European Jewry, including The Book Smugglers and the Rise of Modern Yiddish Culture. He is a member of the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and serves on the editorial boards of Jewish Social Studies and Colleen. We will leave time at the end of the program for questions as usual, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type out and submit your questions, and we will answer as many as possible. And now it is my great honor to welcome Dr. David E. Fishman.
Thank you, Mary Pat. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be with you, at least remotely, and to share this happy occasion of the exhibit opening in Dallas. I want to thank the museum, in particular Annie Black and the staff that put this evening together. Most of the evening, I'm going to be showing you slides and talking extemporaneously based on the PowerPoint, a little bit about how I came to write this book, and a kind of synopsis of what the book is about. And I will come back, you'll see my face, I promise, toward the end. Let me get back to the beginning. And excuse me. Okay, I have to get to the, bear with me 1 second, folks.
David, one option on the bottom right of your screen next to that little minus sign, yeah, that one right there. If you press that, you should be in presenter mode.
There we are. Now I'll move
Okay.
up to the beginning. Thank you. Thank you, Annie. Okay. Here we are, and this is the book. The book has appeared in 8 languages so far, including most recently in Hebrew. It will appear in Russian next year, and I'm really pleased at the impact it's had on this, people getting to know this rather unknown chapter of Jewish heroism in the Holocaust. I want to start my story with how this all happened to me. It goes back more than 30 years, 32 or 33 years. I was young then. I was a freshly minted PhD from Harvard, and I'd moved to New York to work at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And one day, I get a call from the director of this institution known as YIVO, the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, which is an institute for the study of East European Jewry, Yiddish language, the Jews of Russia, Poland, Ukraine. And the director calls me and said, you know, we just found out, YIVO, I should point out, was founded in Vilna, or Vilnius, today Lithuania. And he calls me 33 years ago and says, we just found out that there's this mountain of Jewish books and papers in a former church in Vilnius, Lithuania. We believe it's our own library and archive. Will you go with me, the director says, you know, to Vilnius, Lithuania, to see what this stuff is? And I went. This is still in 1988. These are still the Soviet Union, though the waning years of the Soviet Union, and found an amazing treasure trove of books and documents and manuscripts. And of course, the whole time I was there, and it's a building that had been a church, I'm wondering, how did this stuff end up here? And I did some research at the time, but then many years later, I wrote an essay, but then many years later, I decided, you know what, this can be the topic of an entire book. And through a lot of work and digging and research, this is the book that I wrote to answer my own question. How did that treasure trove end up in a former church in Lithuania? To start the story, I have to tell you where it takes place. Here is Vilna. Before the war, this is a part of the world where borders changed a lot. Before the war, Vilna was Poland. It was the 4th largest Jewish community in Poland. There were, on the eve of the German invasion, about 70,000 Jews in Vilna. That doesn't sound like enormous, but those 70,000 Jews constituted 30 to 35% of the population of the city. So Jews were a very major presence in Vilna. Now, Vilna had a very special complexion, and Mary Pat mentioned that. It is famous as a center of Jewish learning, of Jewish literature, of Jewish study and reading. And this Rabbi Elijah, the Vilna Gaon, sort of founded that tradition of book culture, of book learning in Vilna. He believed the most important aspect of Judaism was study of the Bible, study of other holy books. And thanks to him, Vilna became the Jerusalem of Lithuania. It was a great center of Jewish printing, of religious literature in the 19th century, such as the book on the left, which is a volume of the Talmud printed in Vilna. And then in the 20th century, when Jews became more modern and more secular, it was a big center of Yiddish literature and Yiddish printing. There were 5 Yiddish daily newspapers in Vilna before the war. And it featured the greatest Jewish library under Jewish auspices in all of Europe. This is the Strashun Library, which is the Jewish Communal Library of Vilna, which was located, the building in the front, the lower building, is the community library, and it was built right adjacent to the old synagogue, the Great Synagogue, which dated back to the 1500s. And this library had Many rarities, 5 incunabula. Incunabula are books printed before the year 1500. There aren't a lot of books printed before 1500. It had many rare printings from the 1500s and 1600s. And here's the reading room. The reading room was open actually 7 days a week. What's unusual here is not Sunday, but Saturday, but Shabbat. The library was open on Shabbat. You couldn't take notes, or you couldn't write in the reading room, but if you had ordered books, you could sit there and read on Saturdays. And there were other great collections in Vilna. I already mentioned this YIVO Institute. When it was founded in Vilna, 1925, as the Yiddish Scientific Institute, and it had, what I want to stress, a great archive, document collection. Every Jewish organization, instead of just throwing out their old papers, sent them to Vilna, to this institute. And it collected personal archives, you know, the correspondence by a famous figure or writer, folklore, all kinds of things, and held it here in the YIVO, which had its own reading room and had all kinds of public educational activity. So Vilna was, I call it in my book, the city of the Jewish book, with a museum, with yeshivas, with teacher seminaries, synagogues, and lots of scholars, writers, political activists with great libraries of their own personal collections. Finally, this is all to set up my story and explain to you what Vilna was in Jewish history. It had writers. You know, people not only read in Vilna, but they even wrote. And this is the Yiddish literary group known as Young Vilna. There are story writers here, novelists, poets, a couple of graphic artists, people, painters and drawers. That what matters to us for this story are these 2 poets. This is Abraham Sutzkever, Avram Sutzkever, who later would become the greatest Yiddish poet of the 20th century. And he was the grandson of a rabbi, but he's a secular man, but he's also an apolitical person, not a Zionist, not a socialist. The only ideology he said he believed in was poetry, and he wrote a lot of nature poetry about trees, about snow and things like that. And next to him, his best friend, Shmerke Kaczergiński. I know that's a long and hard name. I'm just going to call him Shmerke. Very unusual biography. Orphaned as a young child, grew up in an orphanage. Not a lot of poets start out in an orphanage. He became a man of the left, member of the Communist Party, underground Communist Party in Poland at that time. And he wrote much of his writing was political. But the main thing is he's, as you can see from the picture, the heart and the center of the group. He's everybody's best friend, and he held this literary group with their competing egos and ambitions. He held them together. Everybody loved Shmerke. Now, on to our story. I've told you about Vilna, the city of the book. We must now turn to the Holocaust era. The Germans came to Vilna late, not in 1939. This city is much further east. They arrived in 1941 as part of the attack on the Soviet Union. And they came late, but they worked fast. The Jewish population of Vilna, in 6 months, from late June of 1941 till the end of December of 1941, in those 6 months, first 6 months of a German occupation, the Jewish population decreased from 70,000 to 20,000. That's not because of emigration. In other words, 50,000 Jews, more than 2/3 of the Jews of Vilna, were murdered in 6 months' time. They were not sent to death camps. There were not any death camps yet in the second half of 1941. They're just taken to the outskirts of the city to a place where there are these pits and ravines, and they were mowed down by machine gun in what we now call the Holocaust by bullets. In September in the middle of that period of mass murder, massive murder, the Vilna ghetto was created. Actually, originally there were 2 ghettos, but the ghetto number 2 was only there for 6 weeks. Ghetto number 1, the main ghetto, will be there for 2 years. Then in January of 1942, this kind of massive, systematic roundups and deportations and killings stops. Life will be very difficult for the next year and a half, but it will not be this kind of intensive, systematic murder of people. There'll be all kinds of smaller and intermittent atrocities. But that period, the next year and a half, is known as the period of stability of the Vilna ghetto, relative to what happened in the first 6 months. And the life that now becomes a routine is of inmates of the ghetto, most of them leaving the ghetto in the morning for a slave labor site, for a place where they work for virtually nothing, as slaves for the Germans. They leave this gate in the morning, they come back at the end of the day. And because official food rations, they could be working in a factory, they could be working at the train depot, they could be working at all kinds of places. And because official food rations are meager, they want to bring food back into the ghetto. That's of course not permitted, and they have to smuggle the food under their clothing. There are different types of guards here. There are Lithuanian police. There are even Jewish ghetto police. But it's especially dangerous to smuggle food in if there are Germans at the gate. Germans aren't always at the gate, but when they are, body searches are very thorough, and people are sent to their deaths because they tried to smuggle a potato or peas or whatever into the Vilna ghetto. And now I'm ready to turn to the core of my story. I need to mention this German organization with a long name, Einsatzstabsleiter Rosenberg, or often called the Rosenberg Special Detail. This was an agency, a Nazi German agency, to loot cultural treasures all across Europe. This agency, maybe you saw the movie Monuments Men, and in that case, you'd know something about this. They stole art, all from Paris, from Amsterdam. They stole books from all across Europe, because the master race should have the master library, the master museum. They deserve everything. They are the masters. Now, this organization, what is not known, is that it had a Judaica department. You would think that the Germans would just destroy all Jewish cultural treasures, right? If they're destroying the Jews, they should destroy Jewish cultural treasures. That would make sense. But in fact, the Germans didn't quite do it that way. They destroyed most Jewish cultural treasures, but a certain proportion they wanted to keep. They wanted to keep for themselves. And the reason they wanted to keep it for themselves is because they had a field of anti-Semitic Jewish studies. They called it Judenforschung, study of the Jews. In other words, they had a science, quote unquote, to prove just how evil the Jews were, how depraved they were, what a threat they were to the Aryan race. And they had specialists and scholars producing reams of anti-Semitic scholarship, quote unquote. But if you're going to do that, you need the raw material, you need the sources, you need books, you need papers. And so they developed institutes just for the study of the Jews, all with the Nazi ideology, supporting scientifically the persecution and mass murder of the Jews. This is the head of that Judaica department of the Rosenberg detail, Dr. Johannes Paul. He's fluent in Hebrew, He's fluent in Yiddish. He is a kind of Judaica expert. He came to Vilna 2 weeks after the German army invaded the city. He knows, Dr. Paul, that Vilna is a special city with great Jewish collections. And he wants to get a lay of the land as soon as possible. So he's literally there, on the heels of the German military. And what he finds stuns him. Here you can see a Jewish book with a Nazi swastika intended for the Institute for the Investigation of the Jewish Question in Frankfurt. What he finds stunned him. Even Paul, an expert, didn't expect to find so many libraries, so many books. And he's got a problem on his hand. He doesn't know what to send to Germany. He doesn't need to send 9, 10 copies of the same book to Germany. He needs someone to pick out 1 or 2 copies at most. Then the rest will be sent to, disposed of as trash. But who can do that? And that's when he and his staff come up with an idea. What do you mean, of course, who can do that? Jewish slave laborers can do that. We'll create another slave labor brigade of Jewish intellectuals, scholars, teachers, and they will sort what will be sent to Germany and what will be destroyed. And the Germans create a quota. 70% must be destroyed. No more than 30% can be sent to Germany. And they create this Jewish slave labor brigade, which gets to be known as the Paper Brigade. Head of the brigade, a professional librarian, Hermann Kruk, and also politically a socialist, a member of the Social Democrats of the Jewish Bund. His deputy is a scholar from the YIVO Institute, Zelig Kalmanovich. Kalmanovich knew everything, actually. They called him a walking encyclopedia. Politically or ideologically, he was a Zionist. His son lived in Palestine, in Eretz Yisrael, in the 1930s. And in the late 30s, Kalmanovich became a religious believer and an observant religious Jew. And here are our poets, those 2 poets we saw before. They too are engaged to work for this brigade, which gets the nickname the Paper Brigade. That's Shmerke again on the left and Sutzkever on the right. And I want to mention one other member. In all, there were 40 people who worked for this brigade, 20 intellectuals and 20 technical workers, people who make boxes and crates, drag them, load, take care of the facility where this took place. But the core is the 20 intellectuals who have to do the sorting job. And that last person of this brigade I want to mention is this woman in the center. Her name is Rachella Krinsky. She was a high school teacher of history. She had a master's degree from Vilna University. She knew Latin. She knew medieval Old Polish. Very educated woman. And she has a very special personal history. Her husband was killed by the Germans literally in the first few weeks in July of 1941. They had a baby, a toddler, a little girl, almost 2 years old. When the ghetto was formed and all Jews were driven into the ghetto, forced to live in these 7, 8 blocks of the Vilna ghetto, she decided, I'm not taking my little girl into the ghetto. She handed the girl over to her Polish nanny and said, you take care of her. And the nanny moved to another part of town and raised the girl, who's not yet 2 years old, as if it were her own daughter. And Rachella enters the ghetto, the mother, alone, without her husband, without her daughter. All she has are her friends, including the poets, and then the work at this Paper Brigade. And this is the work. Mountains upon mountains of books. And you make piles. What will go to Germany? What will go to destruction because the rest is disposed of just as trash. And that is the most painful thing for these staff workers to see. They're all avid readers. They're all avid book lovers. Who are they? We're talking about writers, we're talking about scholars, we're talking about educators, a couple of musicians and artists, but they all love books. And they have to watch as bulldozers come and destroy Jewish culture. The building where they work is actually the former YIVO building, now taken over. Instead of being this sort of center of Yiddish culture, it is now got a big German swastika in the entrance hall. And they're going through papers of different types. And as they can't live with themselves because they're being forced to be accomplices or collaborators in the destruction of Jewish culture. And they have to come up with another solution. And that solution is to hide material, to smuggle material. Now remember, this brigade will last for 1.5 years. And the smuggling and the hiding they will do every day, 20 people for approximately 500 days. They will end up rescuing thousands, even tens of thousands of items. I have to make an aside here. There's only one type of Jewish material that the Germans don't destroy fully and don't send to Germany, and that is Torah scrolls. Torah scrolls, the most precious object in the Jewish religion. They're made out of parchment, which is leather. And so the Germans cut up the Torah scrolls into pieces so that they could use them as inserts to repair Nazi German army boots. And maybe this picture, this desecration, for any Jew or any even cultured person, it elicits revulsion and elicits anger. And I'm sure for the members of the paper brigade, this is what said to them: we must risk our lives to save what we can. We can't let it be this way. And the main way that they rescue material, and I can't go through all the ways in a short talk, is by hiding little books and papers and even small objects under their clothing, on their bodies, because the work site, the former YIVO building, is outside the ghetto, like all other work sites. So they're going back into the ghetto at the end of the day, and they take this stuff back to the ghetto. Why back to the ghetto? Because there it's close to them. It's in Jewish hands. It's accessible. They feel close to it. So, but when they go to the gate again, the risk is the body search. If it's Lithuanians or Jewish ghetto police, it's not a big problem. But if there are Germans, they can be sent to their deaths. They can and were beaten badly. In short, none of them they were lucky. None of them were sent to their deaths, but many of them were beaten very badly upon entering the ghetto if material was found by Germans on their bodies. And there are many dramatic moments at the gate, which I recommend you'll see in the exhibit, or even better yet, in the book. Once in the ghetto, they mainly hide this material underground in bunkers and in cellars. This is a diagram of the major book bunker. You entered through a manhole and the sewage system. You went down a ladder. There are all kinds of, this was built by a Jewish construction engineer who was an inmate of the Vilna ghetto. And actually it was used for two purposes. The other purpose being to hide arms there, because there was an armed underground in the Vilna ghetto, which was planning to have a great Vilna ghetto uprising, like the Warsaw ghetto uprising. And so whatever guns they could get, they put here. So you had guns and books side by side. If you want the two main forms of Jewish resistance to the Nazis, armed resistance and a kind of moral, spiritual resistance. I want to mention briefly that another way that material was rescued was with non-Jewish friends. This is Anna Shemaitė. She's an ethnic Lithuanian, a professional librarian. Now you might be wondering, how could non-Jewish friends help? The answer is the Germans did not guard this site, their work site, during the lunch hour. The Germans went out for lunch and left the Jewish workers there alone. No one's going to escape because, first of all, if one person escapes, the whole group will be killed. If the whole group escapes, then all their families and friends will be killed. So no one leaves. But during the lunch hour, non-Jewish friends can come visit them. And when they do, they can take away piles of papers and books, which they can hide in their own places, as long as they leave before the Germans come back from lunch. And Anna Shemaitė is one such person, one such hero who hid Jewish cultural treasures. To move the story on, our poets were fortunate. They belonged to that underground armed resistance in the Vilna ghetto. And the armed resistance in the Vilna ghetto, in the lingering days of the ghetto, decided to leave the ghetto before it was liquidated, before everybody was sent on to other camps. Shmerke and Sutzker left the ghetto literally a week before that, in 43, and lived the next year in the forests, joined Soviet partisan brigades and fought against the Nazis. And as such, these two poets will survive. The vast majority of the members of the paper brigade did not survive. The Crook, the librarian, Kalmanovich, the scholar, they were sent to camps in Estonia, where they were murdered. In fact, of the 40 people in this brigade, more than 30 perished and less than 10 survived. Rachella Krinsky survived, just barely and quite miraculously. She was deported to this camp, Stutthof. Many Jews from Lithuania were Stutthof in what is today Western Poland, is not famous like Auschwitz, but actually it was an overflow camp for Auschwitz in 1944, Auschwitz working at full capacity. And therefore, there was a crematorium in Stutthof, and a gas, not a gas chamber, but a crematorium. People were shot and then cremated. She survived everything. She kept looking at the smokestack from the crematorium, expecting that she'll be the next person to go up that way in smoke. But she, when she survived, she's a broken person. And she writes, after she's liberated, to the poets, letters, where she says, I don't know what to do with this life that I now have. I know other people are getting married. I can't even imagine being, I have no meaning in my life. There's no purpose in this anymore. She has only one healthy instinct, and that is to reunite with her daughter. She writes, I'm going to try to reunite with my daughter. Not that I can do anything for my daughter in my broken state, but maybe my daughter, she writes in her letters, can do something for me. Maybe I'll find some kind of purpose in life, some kind of meaning in life if I become her mother again. And that will be a whole struggle of hers for the next year, how to see her daughter again. We'll come back to that. The Red Army liberated Vilna on July 13th, 1944. They kick out the Germans, and our poets return that either that day or shortly thereafter. They come back, our poets, Shmerke and Sutzkever, and find a city in ruins. This is the Vilna Gaon's synagogue in ruins. This is the Yivo building in ruins. They came back not to find friends or family. They know their friends and family were all murdered. They're not going back to get real estate property or anything like that. They're going back because they want to dig up the cultural treasures that they hid in these different hiding places and bunkers. They want to finish the job. They're the surviving members of this paper brigade. They owe it to their dead colleagues. They owe it to the Jewish people, that the Jewish people reunite with its cultural treasures. And they begin a retrieval operation. Hand wagons, whatever survivors start to come back to Vilna, they create a kind of volunteer movement with paper, collecting papers, art. Some of the bunkers were intact, some of them were ruined. They do find fragments of Torah scrolls and of all kinds of books. They find artwork and mountains of newspapers that have been collected by the Yivo Institute. And they create a Jewish museum in Vilna, or now as it's called, Vilnius. But this is Soviet-controlled Vilnius. They've gone, I guess you should say, from the frying pan into the oven, or from the oven into the frying pan. This is the Soviet Union. They get a building. It's in the actually was in the ghetto. It's a central address in the ghetto. This field, open area, had been a sports field of the Vilna ghetto. On the far hand, you could see that fence. That was the prison, the ghetto prison. So this site that had been part of the ghetto is now the Jewish Museum in post-war Vilna. But as I said, the Soviets don't want this museum to exist. This is a period of growing state anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union under the last years of Joseph Stalin. And his man in Lithuania is Mikhail Suslov. Suslov is opposed to there being a Jewish museum in Vilna. He creates every possible obstacle he can think of. There's no budget to repair the building. There's no, and then no permission is given for anybody to read any of the material. Whatever surviving Jews there are in Vilna, since there's censorship in the Soviet Union, they are not allowed to read the books. So as Shmerke says, they've been saved from destruction and they're now imprisoned. The books are imprisoned. And then the worst thing is, there was a lot of material kept in the yard, in the courtyard outside, because there wasn't enough space indoors. One night, the sanitation department came and took away all of those materials as trash in the middle of the night and sent it away to be recycled. And that's the moment when the poets realized, as far as it comes to Jewish cultural treasures, the Soviets are not better than the Nazis. Suslov is not better than Johannes Paul, the head of the Judaica department of the ERR. We must rescue the material again, and that means getting it out of the Soviet Union. And they begin to smuggle material through various means from the Soviet Lithuania to Poland. The poets also emigrate to Poland with suitcases. These are our two poets here on the left. And Rachella Krinsky comes to Poland from her Stutthof camp and writes to the nanny and says, "You're a Polish nanny. You, as a former Polish citizen, have the right to migrate to Poland. Come to Poland and bring my daughter with me." And she reunites with her daughter after 4 years of separation in Lodz in Poland. This girl doesn't recognize this woman. She calls her ma'am. She was less than 2 when they were separated. Now she's more than 6. She calls the nanny mommy. So it's a very long and difficult process through which mother and daughter rebond. And then she can write finally in a letter, "I did it. She is my daughter again." The Jewish Museum was closed down. Suslov had his way. all the material in this Jewish museum, all the rescue material there was sent away to different Lithuanian repositories, libraries, museums. And here we are again, the book chamber of the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic, which received the lion's share of the books and the papers. The director did everything he could to save that material, but he was also afraid to have it because this is he knew the Soviet Union is anti-Semitic. And so he hid it inside his own repository, under mountains of other material. And the Jewish material lay there in a kind of hiding for 40 years, from the late 1940s until the late 1980s, when my colleagues and I came to look at it for the first time. What did they save? This is my last thing. I've got like 3 more minutes. I'm giving you some examples of the items that they rescued. Here's a diary by Theodor Herzl, the father of modern Zionism, written in the 1880s, before he founded the Zionist movement. They rescued the record book of the synagogue of the Vilna Gaon. That synagogue that I showed you a picture was in ruins, destroyed by bombs and shelling, but the minute book of the board of the operation of the institution, which spans more than 150 years, that was rescued. All kinds of little books, rare books. These are small format, like prayers for childbirth. Before modern medicine, really only, this is a book from 1837. Before modern medicine came to Eastern Europe, you know, praying was the best you could do if you had a difficult labor. Letters by the great Yiddish writer Shalom Aleichem, who wrote Tevi the Dairyman, that became the basis for Fiddler on the Roof. A bust of Leon Tolstoy, done by a Jewish sculptor, Ilya Ginsburg, who knew Tolstoy personally. And then material from the Holocaust era itself, because they collected, not only did they rescue pre-war treasures, but they also collected material during the ghetto. The Vilna Ghetto was famous for its cultural life, and it had a symphony orchestra. This is a program of a concert given by the Vilna Ghetto Symphony Orchestra. And yet another famous document, a call for arms from the underground resistance in the Vilna Ghetto. Brothers, let us not go like sheep to the slaughter. To wrap up, what happened with our heroes? Sutzkever from Europe settled in Israel, even before it was the state of Israel. He arrived in late 1947. He had a long and illustrious career as a Yiddish writer in the Hebrew state of Israel. Schmerke, the other poet, ended up settling in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where he headed a Jewish culture organization. When he did, he said, I know what it means to be dedicated to Jewish culture. Me and my colleagues of the Paper Brigade and the Vilna Ghetto, we showed what it means to be dedicated to Jewish culture. And I promise to show that level of dedication in my new position. Rachella Krinsky eventually came to America. She lived in New York and later in New Jersey. She remarried, something she never imagined she would do, but she met a fellow survivor of the Vilna Ghetto, and she raised her daughter and lived to see her growing up her granddaughter. Her granddaughter is Alex Wall, who lives in the Berkeley area in California today. To wrap it up, I just want to say, you know, why did these people do this? They did it for many reasons, but I think they really felt that a people cannot live without its culture. They did it for the future. They did it for future generations of the Jewish people, that they didn't expect to survive, but they did hope that future generations of Jews would want to explore their heritage, their books, their papers, their art. They did it as an act of faith that the future needed this. They also decided if I'm going to be killed, I'd rather be killed because I tried to rescue a rare book, not because I tried to smuggle a potato. They wanted what's left of their life and their death possibly to be connected with something they considered truly important, which is culture, the survival of culture. And so they're extraordinary heroes. If a hero is someone that risks their life for something bigger than them, not just for themselves, but something bigger than them, then clearly these people are heroes because they're willing to risk their life for books, for papers, for cultural treasures. And they can inspire us. They can inspire all of us. Certainly for Jews, they are an inspiring story of people willing to do anything to perpetuate Jewish heritage. And I think for all human beings, this is a story of people who believe that culture mattered, that literature, that art are not peripheral things in life. And these kind of inspiring characters are important for us to have as we move through our lives at this time. Thank you for listening, and I believe there's time now for questions.
We do. We have a few questions. Thank you so much, David. And as a reminder, if you still have questions, feel free to enter those using the Q&A button. Our first question, and I'm not sure if you remember the exact moment you decided to turn this story into a book, but if you do, from that time to collecting all of these stories, how long would you say the process of writing this book took you?
Okay, thank you. It took 6 years. It took 6 years because I had a lot more research to do. I can tell this as a story, but it took a lot of, and I couldn't use oral history. By the time I wrote this, very few of my heroes were alive. Virtually none of them were alive. Even those who were alive said to me, I really don't remember a lot. I was fortunate they had written memoirs much earlier, or diaries. But there was a lot of digging. And it was exciting because, archives, not only in the obvious places, which is Vilnius and New York and Washington and Jerusalem, but also archives in Moscow and in Warsaw and in Kiev and in all kinds of places. So it's pieced together from a lot of research. For the scholars out there, of course, that's one of the things I'm proud of, how I was able to reconstruct this story from many, many different sources.
And one of our attendees asked if you ever met any of the book smugglers. You sort of just answered it. So sounds like you got to meet a handful of them, or who did you get to talk to?
I did know the poet of Sutzkever, but I knew him before I knew I was going to write on this topic. So I didn't even ask him much about this when I knew him. And then by the time I came back to him with questions on this topic, he was too ill and too elderly. The person I met who was a good friend of mine, was a technical worker in the paper brigade. That was not one of these intellectuals, but one of the guys who made boxes and dragged the boxes. He was the youngest member of he was 18 when they hired him. And I met him by coincidence because I gave a talk on the Vilna ghetto and I mentioned the paper brigade, and he came over to me at the end of the talk and he said, I worked in that brigade. And I didn't believe him because I thought it was too late in time for anyone to be alive. But he told me things, and I started to realize he really did work in that brigade. And we became very good friends. His name was Michael Mencken, and he passed away just a couple of years ago, but he did live to see the publication of my book, and he was very, we had a very special bond. And he did explain some things that I didn't know from any other source.
And then this might be a lot of things, but if it is, maybe if you can pick one or two. Was there anything in your research that surprised you that you weren't expecting to find kind of once you started digging into these archives?
Yes, but didn't expect in a couple of ways. You see, I decided at a certain point that this book was not only about the fate of Jewish cultural treasures, it was about the people who were their rescuers. And so the more I dug into their lives, that was a whole dimension I hadn't expected. So that I guess the most surprising thing for me was Rachella Krinsky and the poet Shmerke were lovers. They became lovers in the ghetto. They were both by this point widowed, co-workers working in, and after the war, he proposed to marry her. And even though she loved him dearly, she turned him down. And she turned him down because of her daughter. She knew that this poet was very self-absorbed and egotistical and just wouldn't give the kind of attention she wanted a father to give her daughter. And she largely out of guilt said, I've got to find a really great father for my daughter. So she didn't marry him. So that was a kind of whole dimension of the story. I never knew, and I never imagined that I discovered actually through their family archive.
Interesting. Another question, did members of the Paper Brigade volunteer for this particular assignment, or were they selected by the Nazis in charge of it based on their skills?
Okay, good question. As far as the 20 intellectuals, the Nazis hired Kruk. They walked in one day to the ghetto and they said, the head of the Paper Brigade, who was a professional librarian, and they simply said, "You're working for us." He didn't have any choice about that. So, and he hired all the other intellectuals, but people could turn them down. People turned him down. People turned down the job. Some people just said, "I can't do it. I can't stand to be there and watch the bulldozers come and take the stuff away." So some people, and other people had more practical reasons. They wanted a job where you could meet non-Jews and barter, buy stuff, sell stuff. This is not a good place to work if you're trying to barter. There are no non-Jews. So people could turn down the job, but I think these intellectuals wanted to do the job, especially once they realized what an amazing thing they could do on the side of this job.
Right. We have a couple of sort of related questions that I'll group together. So one asking, the books that were in the church or the materials that you went to see, and any other materials that were maybe sent to other countries. Is there a central location for those now, or are they still spread out? What does that look like?
The stuff that was in the church is still in Vilnius today. It's no longer in the church. The church was given back to the church, and very appropriately so. So it's now in the Lithuanian National Library. And there's a Judaica department there and a very fine librarian. And there's a big digitization project. The YIVO Institute here in New York is digitizing so that it will be available, everything online, wherever you may be. Just to clarify one thing, that's as far as the material that was found in the church. The poets smuggled out some material, in these suitcases, and that material ended up either in New York at the YIVO Institute or in Jerusalem at different Israeli institutions. So this material, in a sense, is now in 3 different countries. It's in Lithuania, it's in America, and it's in Israel.
And are there any items that are yet to be excavated? Is there a chance there are still things buried in bunkers and things like that? Do we know?
We don't know, but we can be sure about. We don't know, but we can be sure of that. In other words, but these things are deep underground. Now, they can be found maybe by happenstance. Depends how they were stored. Paper doesn't preserve very well underground. But even now, there's a big excavation project of the Great Synagogue in Vilna. There are these archaeologists, and of course the community library was right next to the Great Synagogue. So it's not impossible that, through these archaeologists or through other means, sometimes they just have to change the sewage system and change pipes, and they dig underground. It's not impossible that something could be found someday.
And I'll mention for anyone watching tonight who's interested, actually November 1st, we'll have Dr. Freund, who's one of the people working on that site, speaking about that excavation as well. So we can hopefully, I think they're doing a big project in August. So hopefully we'll hear more then. This is an interesting question. Someone asked, what is the cultural meaning of Vilna now? Does it hold the same meaning to Jews today like it did back then?
Well, the same, it can't be the same, but I would say many Jews recognize the name Vilna and maybe have heard the name this rabbi, the Vilna Gaon. And it still has a lure. For many years, there was a Yiddish language summer program at Vilnius University in Vilna, and it attracted a lot of students from abroad. In other words, it's become a kind of pilgrimage site, even though it's in Lithuania, which is a small country. It can't quite compete with Warsaw or Krakow. But I think the memory of Vilna endures as having been a special place in Jewish history.
And to your knowledge, did the Paper Brigade take any inspiration for these activities? They decided to do this risk they took from any other underground networks in Poland, or were they sort of the first to embark on this kind of project of rescuing materials and artifacts? Is that known in any way?
I don't think they had any direct inspiration, again, because the greatest Jewish collections were in Vilna. So there wasn't any city in Eastern Europe with anything comparable as far as great library, great archive. It was in some ways a unique situation. There was something similar, but not quite the same, in Warsaw. And maybe you've heard of the Onik Shabbos and Dr. Emanuel Ringelblum. That was something only similar in the sense of they were a group of basically journalists and historians who wrote the history of the ghetto as it was happening. But they too, everything they wrote, they had to bury underground and hide. And those who survived came back to dig it up. But again, what they were concerned with was documenting the ghetto, the Holocaust, what was happening in the Warsaw Ghetto. Here in Vilna, what they were focused on was rescuing pre-war cultural treasures. These two groups had a little bit of contact with each other. It was very hard. They're in two separate ghettos, hundreds of miles away, but there was some underground correspondence. But I don't think they knew of any. This was their own internal urge. They just had to do it. They didn't need to be inspired by somebody else or some other group.
Thank you. Well, I think we have time for one more question before we wrap up. Could you talk a little bit about how your book became this traveling exhibition, and what was that process like for you to see your work turned into this? I mean, it's an amazing exhibition.
I don't know how much credit I can take there. I mean, I worked with the curators at the Holocaust Museum Houston closely, but they know better than me how to convert, something that's basically a literary document, a book, into what's basically a visual item. So I was feeding them text, but for a museum exhibit, much more important than text is pictures and video and objects. So it's very gratifying. I've never had I spent my career mainly doing rather academic research. First of all, writing books that get read by, a couple of hundred people, graduate students. So this is a real new departure for me to have a book that has had a public resonance. and had a museum exhibit, something I haven't quite imagined. And of course, I do feel somewhere deep down that this is a great tribute to these people. They weren't quite, they weren't given public honors in their lifetime for this activity for a number of reasons. And so, it's beautiful. I wish I could talk with them. Of course, I do talk with their grandchildren. Now we're up to not children, grandchildren. And so for their grandchildren, it's a great moment to see that their grandparents' heroism is appreciated.
Well, good. We love to see that kind of passing down to generations too. Well, Dr. Fishman, thank you so much for being with us tonight. As Mary Pat mentioned, the exhibition opens tomorrow at the museum and runs through January 2nd of 2022. We hope you'll come see it, see a snippet of Dr. Fishman's work, but get his book as well so you can get the whole picture. We appreciate you spending your evening with us and everyone watching tonight, and hope everyone has a great rest of your evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good luck to all of you.